That's kind of the hardest question for someone to ask is like, what nationality are you? Because officially my passport and my citizenship is I'm Canadian, but I was born in Korea and I still have that left in me.
My root is Korean, right? But I'm also Canadian here.
If I want to get the Canadian citizenship or even permanent residence, I have to give up my Korean nationality. So that's the problem for me, and I'm still debating.
그래, 그런 그 고향이 없어진 것 같은 그런 기분.
It was 35 years ago. Oh, that time only around 900 people. Most of them doctor and school teacher, some professional job. Today we got more than 40,000 people, right? Yeah, big change for 35 years.
The change in immigration policy in 1967 with the introduction of the point system had allowed for better access to Canada for Korean migrants, as there was no longer restrictions, quotas, or bias on the people entering.
가지고 아키텍트가 필요하다니까는 짭 트라이를 했는데 짭이 안 돼가지고 처음에 안 돼가지고 이 아빠는 석 달 먼저 와서 짭을 한 다음에 와이프를 데리고 가라 그랬어요.
My case is a little different because people came to Canada. I got job offer, like an AT&T company. That's why I came to Canada, right? But most people doesn't have any job offer. Just came to Canada and then start a new life. So their case, doing small business for survive, right? Like a small grocery, smoke shop, coin laundry, etc.
아, 그러니까 우리가 처음에 오샤와에서 7개월 살고 나서 우리 아빠가 레이업 당했어요. 거기서 6개월 동안 퍼레스토어라고 여기를 말하면 즉 세븐일레븐 같은 거 그거를 7개월 동안 매니저를 했어요. 라발 웨스트라고 프렌치 캐네디안들만 사는 데서. 그래가지고 불란서만 한 개도 모르는데 이런데 그 캐시대 앞에다가 다 그냥 1, 2, 3, 4서부터 뭐 밀크는 뭐다 다 써가지고 7개월 동안 남의 가게 매니저하고 그랬어요.
At that time we had to survive, right? So I never think of the racism, just a job opportunity.
지금은 밴쿠버 같은 데는 속으로 인종차별하지만 겉으로는 인종차별을 못해요. 워낙 동양 애들이 많기 때문에. 근데 그때는 동양 사람을 동물 쳐다보듯이 쳐다보고 이렇게 막 내가 지나가면은 막 중국말 이상하게 막 이상한 말을 막 업앤다운하게 해가지고 그래가지고 막 돌을 던지는 애들도 있고 굉장히 약간 동물 취급하는 식으로 하얀 사람들이 그렇게 노골적으로 깔보고 그래서 니네 코리아 어떠냐 그러면 우리는 노프라브럼이고 캡털시티는 여기보다 더 좋고 화려하고 우리는 정말 상류사에서 왔다 그러면 근데 왜 캐나다를 왔냐 그러고 니네 자동차가 다니냐 뭐 말 타고 다니냐 자전거 타고 다니냐 이렇게 모를 때예요. 그리고 니네 나라가 좋으면 돌아가라 막 이러고 컬처가 너무 다르고 그런 것도 처음에 참 이상하고 이름 막 부르는 것도 이상했고 그리고 한국 그런 소리가 없어가지고 김치도 못 담아 먹고 김치 먹고 싶으면 오이 같은 거 해서 담아 먹고.
That time we got one grocery store for Korean market on Commercial and East Broadway, right? The small one. That time we pay a lot of money to buy goods, right? Like a fish, very expensive, and ramen, whatever, Korean grocery, very expensive. I compared to Seattle that time, maybe 3 times more here. But now we got the big supermarket, right? So now I'm compared with that price in Seattle, nearly same. So we are very happy.
So basically, if you needed to get something done as a Korean person, like my parents who didn't speak English, that's where you went to. Like we would always go once a week to Kingsway so we can get our grocery done and my mom would get her bank stuff done. So it was an area where Korean people who didn't speak English or didn't want to have to go to a non-Korean person to do business with, that's where they were at.
After the 1986 business class immigration system revisions, an increased number of prosperous, affluent Koreans began to immigrate to Canada. many of whom were entrepreneurs or well-educated middle-class citizens whose families had decided to leave Korea to avoid unstable socioeconomic conditions or to simply pursue a higher quality of life.
At the time when we moved to Canada, Korea was still considered to be a developing country. So you had to have a certain amount of wealth to come to Canada, but that wealth didn't necessarily translate to being wealthy when you moved to Canada. So basically, we were okay, like we were well off, or we were comfortable living in Korea. But when we came here, we kind of had to start from the bottom level again. We came under an immigration system where there was a condition set for us. So our condition was that by a certain time we had to have started our own small business. So whatever money we had was basically invested towards that business. As far as going to school, I spoke no English. So it was a lot of body language and just a lot of sounds that came out. But I learned English pretty quickly though, because there weren't that many Koreans around, and because of that I was kind of the translator in my from the circle of friends that my parents had. So anytime they needed to do anything official, go to a doctor's office or go apply for something, they used to always take me along because I was the only person that actually spoke the most advanced English out of everyone.
여기 많은 아줌마들이 아들이나 딸들 데리고 다니면서 후욕하고요. 그리고 어디 가도 은행을 가도 자기 아들 데리고 가서 그런 아줌마들이 참 많이 있거든요. 그리고 나는 여기 놀러 왔지, 돈 있는 사람들은 특히 난 여기 놀러 왔지 영어 하러 온 거 아니다. 그러면서 마치 자부심이 영어 못하는 게 자랑인 듯 그렇게 말하는 아저씨들 아줌마들이 60살쯤 되면 너무 많아요.
I don't have the greatest feelings towards the Korean community here, especially with the older generations that are here. And partly the reason is because they grew up in in a small community, they don't try at all to try and adapt to Canadian ways. They don't bother learning the language. It's like they're stuck in their mindset is stuck in Korean ways. So
그래도 이제 여기 10년 살았다고 영어 잘하는 것도 아니고, 그죠? 30년 살았다고 영어 잘하는 것도 아니고 노력 없이는.
The rapid growth of international students and visitors from Korea have been phenomenal since a visa exemption was granted to Koreans in 1994. In the late 1990s, Korea was the leading source of international student inflows to Canada. In 2001 alone, there were over 18,000 student visa permits granted in Canada. Since then, an increasing number of Korean students have been coming to Canada every year.
Yeah, when I was in Korea, many Korean friends told me that don't hang around with Korean guys because that they speak only Korean and you can't use English, so that your English will not be improved. Oh yeah, honestly, my friends' proportion is 70% of Korean friends and 30% of Canadian friends.
I have more Canadian friends than Korean friends. When I was growing up, my mom discouraged me from hanging around other
Koreans who came to Canada after they have raised up in Korea, yeah, they're just Korean, just living in Canada. So that there is no problem when I hang around with them. But the Koreans who born in Canada, there is a kind of difficulties to hang around with them because they look like Korean, but they are Canadian totally. So even they cannot speak Korean, so that we have to communicate in English, and their thinking process or cultural background is all about Canada, because even though they raised by Korean parents, they went to Canadian school and the Canadian secondary school and Canadian universities. They're totally whitewashed, and I think some kind of difference is between us.
I remember growing up in Korea, or even the first time I went to Korea, there weren't that many foreigners in Korea. It was all Korean people. English was barely spoken in that country. But when I went back, 7 years ago, there were a lot of foreigners there, and English was much more common. And so, being there, I wasn't treated as a Korean, nor was I treated as a foreigner. So I was kind of stuck in between, and I felt like I stood out like a sore thumb because I looked different, but the same at the same time.
I had to change myself to, how can I say that, settle in Canada. so that I'm changed and I go back to Korea. But it's not previous me, right?
캐나다도 미국도 안 갈 것 같아. 안 갈 것 같아.
한국에.
한국에서 그냥 있으면 더 잘 살고.
I would personally choose not to go and live back in Korea.
My idea is I have to devote more much for Canadian society than Korean because I'm here, right, for 35 years.
I want to raise my kid as Korean and living in Canada.